Assalamu alaikum, let's explore this Islamic topic together. Hey, so, you wanna know about Quranic justice and how it shook things up in 7th century Arabia? It's a fascinating story, really. Think about it. Imagine a world without established laws. A world ruled largely by tribal customs, where strength and lineage determined everything. That's the Arabia the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born into. It was a complex society, a beautiful tapes woven with threads of loyalty, hospitality, and fierce independence, but also marked by deep-seated inequalities and brutal practices. Think blood feuds. For example, if someone from your tribe wronged someone from another, it often sparked generations of violence. A cycle of revenge with devastating consequences. Women had incredibly limited rights. Their testimony in court was often worth half a man's, or even completely disregarded. Inheritance laws favored men, and the treatment of widows and orphans could be incredibly harsh. Slavery was widespread, and the treatment of slaves varied wildly depending on the whims of their owners. Now, imagine this chaotic landscape and then picture the arrival of the Quran. The Quran wasn't just a religious, it was a complete legal and ethical framework. It was a revolutionary document that started challenging these deeply entrenched tribal norms. Think of it as a huge societal reset button, pushing for a fair and just system that went against the grain of what people were used to. One of the most significant aspects of Quranic justice was its inequality. The Quran repeatedly emphasized the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of their tribe, wealth, or gender. This was a radical concept in 7th century Arabia, where tribal affiliation dictated nearly every aspect of life. Suddenly, the law wasn't about who you knew or what tribe you belonged to, but about what was right and just. The Quran introduced concepts like qisas*, which is the principle of retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But it wasn't simply a barbaric call for revenge. It was about proportionate justice, preventing excessive punishment and establishing a framework for settling disputes fairly. It also introduced the concept of diya, blood money, compensation paid to the victim's family instead of resorting to immediate blood vengeance. This was a revolutionary idea that aimed to break the cycle of violence. Imagine, instead of endless feuds tearing apart families and tribes, there was a way to reconcile and find a resolution through financial compensation. This wasn't about letting criminals off scot-free. It was about introducing a more civilized and controlled response to crime. Then there's the issue of women's rights. The Quran significantly elevated the status of women, granting them rights previously unimaginable. It gave women the right to own property, to inherit, to enter into contracts, and to testify in court, although with certain stipulations depending on the nature of the case. It outlawed practices like female infanticide, which was tragically common at the time. While not fully achieving modern standards of gender equality, it was a massive leap forward, fundamentally challenging the patriarchal system of the time. Dealing with slavery was also a major undertaking. The Quran didn't immediately abolish slavery, which was a deeply embedded part of the Arabian economy and society. However, it introduced significant reforms. It emphasized the humane treatment of slaves, set limits on harsh punishments, and encouraged emancipation. The Quran provided pathways for slaves to gain their freedom and offered incentives for their masters to release them. It gradually, over time, began to erode the institution of slavery through these reforms and ethical pronouncements. It's important to remember that the implementation of Quranic justice wasn't a smooth, overnight transformation. There was resistance from entrenched tribal leaders and powerful families. There were debates and interpretations. And the transition from tribal customs to a divinely ordained legal system was a gradual. Think of it as a slow but significant shift in the cultural and societal norms. The Prophet Muhammad and his companions had to navigate the complexities of applying these new laws within the existing social fabric, often finding creative and practical solutions to bridge the gap between the divine law and prevailing traditions. The story of Quranic justice is not just about a set of rules. It's a story of societal transformation, of a radical shift in values and beliefs. It's a story of how a divine law attempted to create a more just and equitable society, grappling with the challenges of implementing such a sweeping change in a world deeply rooted in its own customs and traditions. It demonstrates the powerful impact of a legal and ethical framework that prioritizes justice, equality, and the dignity of all human beings. And that's a story that continues to resonate today, inspiring ongoing dialogues and interpretations about justice and fairness in the modern world. It's a rich and complex history, and hopefully, I've given you a good taste of it. Hey, so, you know how we were talking about how laws and justice systems evolve? Well, let's dive into something fascinating. The early days of Islamic law in 7th century Arabia. Imagine a time before codified laws as we know them. A world ruled largely by tribal customs, strong, deeply ingrained traditions that sometimes clashed pretty dramatically with what we'd consider fair or just. That's the backdrop to this whole story of Quranic justice. Think of 7th century Arabia as a patchwork of different tribes, each with its own set of rules. Blood feuds were common. A slight could easily escalate into generations-long cycles of revenge killings. Women often had limited rights. Their testimonies often considered less valuable than men's in legal matters. Inheritance laws were skewed, favoring certain family members over others. Slavery was widespread, and its practices were brutal. Basically, it was a really tough, often unfair world. Now picture the Prophet Muhammad arriving on the scene in Makkah. He's not just preaching a new religion. He's also presenting a radically different approach to justice. The Quran, the central religion of Islam, wasn't just a collection of religious beliefs. It was also a blueprint for a more equitable and just society. It directly addressed many of the deeply entrenched problems of the time. This wasn't some theoretical discussion. It was about real-life issues affecting real people. The early stages of implementing this new justice system were, well, a bit of a delicate dance. You had this incredible new set of divine principles, emphasizing fairness, compassion, and social responsibility, colliding with established tribal customs that were centuries old. Imagine the resistance. People were used to their ways. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges ingrained power structures. For example, take the issue of blood feuds. The Quran strongly condemned the practice, emphasizing forgiveness and reconciliation. This was revolutionary. Suddenly, the age-old cycle of revenge wasn't simply the way things are, it was actively discouraged. Even morally wrong. But convincing warring tribes to give up their age-old traditions and embrace forgiveness? That was a monumental challenge. The same was true for women's rights. Pre-Islamic Arabian society significantly disadvantaged women. The Quran, however, provided a different picture, stressing their importance, their rights to inheritance, and their right to testify in court, albeit with some adjustments and considerations. This was a total game changer. It wasn't just about equality in the abstract. It was about concrete changes to inheritance and testimony laws. Things that directly impacted women's lives and their ability to protect themselves and their families. And then there was the issue of slavery. The Quran didn't abolish slavery overnight, a fact that often surprises people. But it did introduce significant reforms. It emphasized humane treatment of slaves, encouraged manumission, the freeing of slaves, and regulated the practice to mitigate some of its worst abuses. This wasn't a sudden abolition, but a gradual of reform that aimed to create a more compassionate system over time. This approach, while imperfect by today's standards, was radical for its time. What really started to shape this new era of Quranic justice was the way the Prophet Muhammad dealt with disputes. He didn't just apply the Quranic verses verbatim. He adapted and interpreted them in light of the specific situation, demonstrating a remarkable level of wisdom and pragmatism. He used his judgment to find ways to bridge the gap between divine law and existing tribal practices. He often mediated disputes, mediating between warring factions, on reconciliation and compromise. He created a system of arbitration and used his charisma and authority to lead the community in a new direction. That was far from smooth. It involved a lot of negotiation, compromise, and gradual implementation. There were undoubtedly disagreements, pushback, and setbacks. But the very attempt to reconcile tribal customs with divine law, the very effort to create a more just society, principles of fairness, compassion, and social responsibility, was a defining moment in history. It laid the groundwork for a legal and ethical framework that would significantly shape the development of Islamic civilization for centuries to come. It wasn't about instantly creating a perfect utopia, but about a journey towards a fairer, more just world, one step at a time, one dispute at a time. And that journey started with those early attempts to reconcile the old ways with the new. It's a story of significant change, slow but steady progress, and the ongoing effort to strive for justice. Pretty amazing, right? Hey, so, we were talking about how the Quran changed things in 7th century Arabia. Right? We touched on the early days. But things get really interesting when you dive into the middle chapters of the Quran. That's where the real wrestling match between established tribal customs and the newly revealed divine law gets intense. Imagine Arabia then. Fiercely independent tribes, each with its own set of rules. Often brutal and blood feuds, vengeance, and patriarchal power structures. Think honor killings, unequal treatment of women, deeply ingrained biases. It wasn't exactly a utopian society. They had their own forms of justice, of course, but it was often arbitrary, biased, and lacked any real consistency across different tribes. You could get away with murder, depending on your clan's strength and influence. Sounds crazy, right? But that was their reality. Then, Muhammad, peace be upon him, starts receiving revelations, and the Quran starts unveiling a completely different system of justice. Principles of fairness, compassion, and accountability before God. It's not just a set of laws. It's a whole new ethical framework. The early revelations aired on fundamental tenets, monotheism, basic morality. But as the message spread, the Quran started directly addressing the injustices deeply embedded in Arabian society. And that's where the tension builds. Think about the issue of women. In many tribes, women had virtually no rights. They were often seen as property, with limited legal standing, subject to the whims of their male relatives. The Quran, chapter by chapter, starts chipping away at this. It emphasizes the equal worth of men and women before God, stressing their shared humanity. It protects women's rights to inheritance, to divorce, to fair treatment in marriage. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was revolutionary, clashing directly with centuries of ingrained patriarchal norms. Or take the issue of blood feuds. These were a cornerstone of tribal life. A slight, a perceived insult, could trigger a cycle of violence that could last for generations. Families, entire clans, locked in bitter conflict, fueled by revenge and tribal honor. The Quran, however, introduced the concept of diya, a system of blood money. Instead of endless cycles of vengeance, they shifted towards reconciliation, restitution, and a monetary compensation to the victim's family. This wasn't about letting murderers go free. It was about finding a path towards peace and breaking the vicious cycle of violence that threatened the stability of the entire society. Another crucial area is the treatment of orphans and the poor. In pre-Islamic Arabia, vulnerable members of society often faced exploitation and neglect. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes the importance of caring for the weak, the needy, and the marginalized. It mandates just treatment, fair distribution of wealth, and prohibits exploitation. These commands challenged the existing social hierarchy and called for a more just and equitable society. Now, imagine the reaction. This wasn't easy. Many powerful tribal leaders had vested interests in the old order. Changing the system meant challenging their authority, their privileges, their way of life. They resisted. They argued. They questioned. There was a lot of debate, a lot of pushback. The Quran itself acknowledges this resistance, addressing specific objections, providing clarification, and gradually revealing the legal framework in a way that navigated the complexities of the existing social fabric. It wasn't a sudden, revolutionary overthrow. It was a gradual, nuanced of reform and transformation. The middle chapters are filled with these stories, stories of conflicts, compromises, gradual shifts in attitudes and practices. It's fascinating to observe how the Quran, through its verses, addressed specific situations, guided the community towards justice, and gradually transformed the understanding of law and ethics. It's a testament to the power of divine law to shape society, to inspire change, even in the face of deeply entrenched cultural practices. It's important to remember this wasn't just a theoretical exercise. These were real people, facing real dilemmas, grappling with the implications of a radical new ethical and legal system. The Quran's response was not just to lay down the law, but also to offer guidance, to provide calm, and to address the complexities of human nature and social dynamics within a specific historical and cultural setting. That's what makes it so compelling to study, the real-life struggle to reconcile the old with the new, the tribal with the divine. And it's a story that continues to resonate today, prompting us to reflect on the challenges of reconciling tradition and justice in our own times. Okay, so we've been talking about how the Quran's arrival completely shook things up in 7th century Arabia. Right? We've covered the tribal customs, the blood feuds, the ingrained inequalities. It was a pretty wild and often brutal world. Imagine a society where your clan's standing, your wealth, or lack thereof, and even your gender dictated almost every aspect of your life. Justice, as we understand it today, was practically non-existent. It was all about tribal power plays and revenge. Now, the Quran comes along, and it's like a huge earthquake hitting that established order. Remember, before Islam, The dominant system was built on *Jahiliya*, which basically means the age of ignorance. It wasn't about ignorance in the sense of lacking knowledge, but rather ignorance of the true path, a path towards a just and compassionate society. This system had its own ways of settling disputes, but they were often deeply flawed and biased. Think about blood money. Diya, for example, a payment made to the victim's family to avoid further bloodshed. While it sounds civilized on the surface, it often favored the wealthier tribes, letting them literally buy their way out of serious consequences. Women were particularly vulnerable under this system. Their testimony held less weight than a man's, and their rights were significantly curtailed. So, how does the Quran's message of justice start to chip away at this entrenched system? It doesn't do it overnight. That's for sure. It's a gradual, a delicate dance between upholding the existing social fabric and introducing radical new concepts of fairness and equality. The Quran doesn't just abolish tribal customs completely. That would have been disastrous, leading to utter societal chaos. Instead, it acts as a corrective lens, refining and reforming the existing structures. One key area where this reconciliation is evident is in the treatment of women. While women weren't suddenly granted total equality overnight, that's a much longer, ongoing journey even today. The Quran unequivocally granted them rights and protections that were unheard of before. It emphasized their inherent worth, addressed issues like inheritance and divorce, and condemned practices like female infanticide. This wasn't a simple shift. It sparked debates and resistance, but it laid the foundation for a more equitable social order. Think about the concept of *qisas*, or retributive justice. The Quran acknowledges the human desire for revenge, but it also places limits on it. It introduces the principle of proportionality, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but simultaneously encourages forgiveness and reconciliation whenever possible. It's a nuanced approach, recognizing the need for justice while simultaneously promoting compassion and mercy. It was a significant step away from the unchecked vengeance often seen in tribal conflicts. Similarly, the Quran tackles the issue of wealth distribution. It stresses the importance of zakat, the obligatory charitable giving, to help the poor and needy, directly challenging the immense wealth disparity that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. This wasn't just about charity. It was a mechanism for social reform, aiming to redistribute wealth and reduce inequality, a revolutionary concept for the time. Of course, the implementation of these ideals wasn't always smooth. Even under the Prophet Muhammad's leadership, there were challenges. The transition from a system tribal allegiance and blood feuds to one guided by divine law required continuous effort, adaptation, and interpretation. There were disagreements, debates, and adjustments along the way, reflecting the complex realities of society. The Quran served as the foundation, but the practical application of its principles involved considerable negotiation and compromise. So, how did it all conclude? Well, it didn't really conclude, in the sense of a neat ending. The of reconciling tribal customs with divine law was a continuous evolution, not a single event. The Quran laid the groundwork for a legal and social system that, while deeply rooted in its core, offered a vision of justice and equality far ahead of its time. It was a paradigm shift, a journey towards a more just and compassionate society. The legacy of this ongoing reconciliation is felt in Islamic jurisprudence and legal systems too. This day, constantly evolving and adapting to new challenges and interpretations. It wasn't a perfect system, And it certainly encountered and continues to encounter its share of complexities and challenges. But it remains a crucial turning point in the history of justice and its attempts to transcend the limitations of tribal societies. It's a story of progress, albeit an ongoing and often imperfect one. Okay, so you want to talk about how the Quran's approach to justice in 7th century Arabia still matters today? That's a fascinating topic. It's not just about dusty old laws. It's about understanding the evolution of a moral compass within a specific historical con, and how its principles continue to resonate, even if the application looks quite different now. Think about 7th century Arabia. It was a patchwork of tribes, each with its own fiercely independent set of customs and laws. Justice often meant tribal vengeance, an eye for an eye, blood for blood, often escalating into endless cycles of conflict. Women had limited rights, often treated as property. The weak were at the mercy of the strong. It was a chaotic, brutal world, really. Imagine the sheer power imbalance. Then comes the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with the revelations of the Quran. And it's not just a simple, here's a new rulebook, situation. The Quran doesn't just abolish tribal customs outright. It engages with them, challenges them, and gradually works towards a more just and equitable system. It's not an instant transformation. One key concept is the idea of *ADL*, often translated as justice, but it's richer than that. It means fairness, equity, balance, a striving for righteousness in all aspects of life. The Quran doesn't just lay down specific laws. It establishes principles designed to address the specific injustices prevalent at a time. For example, the pre-Islamic practice of burying female infants alive because of poverty or the shame associated with having daughters was abhorrent. The Quran unequivocally condemns this practice. It elevates the status of women, emphasizing their dignity and rights, though the full realization of these rights took centuries to unfold. It wasn't a magical overnight change. Societal norms are deeply ingrained. The Quran also tackles issues like blood feuds. Instead of encouraging endless retaliation, it introduces the concept of diya, blood money, as a way to reconcile warring tribes and prevent further bloodshed. This was a radical departure from the prevailing tribal norms, offering a path towards peace and reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, the amount of diya could still vary social standing, reflecting lingering inequalities, but it was a step towards a more regulated and hopefully less violent system of justice. Another significant area is the protection of the vulnerable. Orphans, widows, the poor, those who were often marginalized in pre-Islamic society, receive specific attention in the Quran. There are clear commands about their rights, their care, and their protection from exploitation. This emphasis on social justice is a defining characteristic of Quranic law. It's not just about individual piety. It's about creating a just and equitable society for everyone. However, it's important to understand that the application of these principles wasn't always straightforward. The transition from tribal customs to a divinely ordained legal framework was gradual, fraught with challenges, and sometimes inconsistent. Remember, it was a society in transition. There were debates, interpretations, and compromises along the way. So, what does all this teach Muslims today? I think there are several key takeaways. The importance of conal understanding. We need to understand the historical con in which the Quranic laws were revealed. We can't simply lift verses out of Quran and apply them blindly to modern situations. The principles remain relevant, but the specific applications need to be adapted to the circumstances of our time. The ongoing struggle for justice. The story of Quranic justice isn't a story of immediate and complete success. It highlights the ongoing, often challenging, struggle for justice and equity. The work is never truly finished. Striving for ADL justice in all aspects of life. This isn't just about legal systems. It's about fairness in all our interactions, in our families, workplaces, communities, and even internationally. It encourages us to question systemic injustices and work towards a more equitable world. The importance of social responsibility. The emphasis on the protection of the vulnerable highlights our collective responsibility to care for those in need. This is a call to action, urging Muslims to actively participate in creating a more just and compassionate society. It's not a static set of rules. It's a living tradition that constantly engages with contemporary issues. The Quran's approach to justice, born from the challenges of 7th century Arabia, provides a powerful framework for reflecting on our own systems of justice and striving for a world that reflects the principles of fairness, equity, and compassion. It's a journey, not a destination, and the quest for true ADL continues to this day. Goodbye, may Allah bless us all. That's our discussion for today.